Hello everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today I want to talk about a story about last Friday. If you follow us on Instagram, you'll know that we were up in Connecticut cleaning out the remaining books in Elliot's book barn. If you recall, a couple months ago, we did a buy day from up in the barn. Well, the barn is now empty, and you can see photos of the empty barn if you go to our Instagram account. Well, we finished about noon. I was feeling good, and I wanted something to do for the rest of the afternoon. So what do when you finish cleaning out a book barn? You go to another book barn, especially if you love books. So we drove to Whitlock's book barn, which is about 20 minutes away, just north of New Haven. And in the car ride over, I turned on the news and I heard the story of the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the Supreme Court's ruling. This was devastating. I was deeply upset, and I want to say clearly that the bookstore's position on this is that we oppose the Supreme Court's decision, and I'm going to tell you partly why that decision was wrong. But I got to the book barn, I started browsing, and I saw a small stack of books by the register that were sort of out of the public view and had been set aside. And a good lesson whenever browsing, see if you can find the books that haven't yet been processed, because they might contain some real gems. And I said, could I look at those books in the pile? And here we're going to open them up, and we're going to see one of those books. And the owner of the bookstore said, sure, you can see it. The book, though, is missing its cover. And as a result, we were thinking about having it repaired. And I'm like, well, that's all right. What's the book? And lo and behold, the book was something I'd never really seen before from that time period. It is A History of Abortion, containing an account in which it takes place and the causes and everything else related to abortion. An entire book on that topic, a second edition, meaning it had gone through multiple editions, published in 1809, right in the early period of American Federalist era. So a shocking discovery, but a timely one on the day. Now, one of the things that really upset me about Alito's opinion is that he said, in the opinion, there was a long history of the criminalization of abortion in America, dating way back to prior to the Constitution. And this is part of a doctrine called originalism, which says that we ought to give credence to the beliefs that the founders had at the time they wrote the Constitution. Now, there's a lot of problems with originalism as an interpretive doctrine. A lot of people who believe in the right to choice would simply say, why do we care what these founders thought? They didn't believe in women's rights. They believed in slavery. Originalism doesn't matter. But the fact of the matter is, he's not even right about his understanding of history, because at the time, abortion was not criminalized in America or Britain. And in fact, it was commonplace, and doctors and midwives performed it all of the time. There was a doctrine which said that prior to the quickening, abortion could happen without any complications at all. The quickening is defined as that moment, maybe 14, 15, 16 weeks into pregnancy, when the mother can feel the movement of the fetus in her body, and that was defined at the time as the beginning of life, not conception. The quickening. And an example of why that matters, or why that was commonly held, here's a sort of morbid example, but if at the time you were sentenced to hang because you committed a crime and you were a woman, if you were pregnant but had not yet reached the quickening, off to the gallows you went. But if you had reached the quickening, they had to wait to execute you until after you'd given birth. And Blackstone writes about this in the commentaries of the time, and the quickening was defined as a critical moment. This book that we found, however, further explains just how commonplace abortion is. It is treated as it should be in medical terms. It's described here, the contents, is something which is quite commonplace, and this is a guide mainly written for midwives and doctors to understand how it happens. But he does even go further than that, and the author says, in no uncertain terms, nothing that he writes, I do not wish from this observation or any other to be understood in any way disapproving of those necessary attempts which are occasionally made to procure premature labor or even abortion when the safety of the mother demands this interference. So obviously the safety of the mother was paramount to doctors at the time, and I would describe abortion as being seen as something of a necessary evil, but not something which was criminal or deserved punishment. So the question is, when does this change in American history? And how does it change? And why does it change? And the answer lies in the Second Great Awakening. And to overly simplify the Second Great Awakening, let me just say in American history, there was a long-standing concept of sin, which basically said we're all sinners, and a belief in predestination and an understanding there wasn't a lot that an individual could do to sort of change one's fate. Second Great Awakening sort of upends that, and instead of saying we're all sinners, it says that maybe someone else could be a sinner and you could act in ways that could get you into heaven. And I'm going to refer you to a book called The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution by my mentor, David Davis, which talks about how slavery itself changed from being a necessary evil to being a positive good because of these changing conceptions of sin. And something very similar happens with abortion. And it happens in America very specifically due to one other thing, which has to do with a charismatic preacher and a sex scandal. You can't get any more American than that. Because in 1817, a gentleman, a minister by the name of Ammi Rogers, well, he goes on a house call to a dying woman, and he ends up impregnating that woman's granddaughter. And then he gets sentenced to jail. Why? Because he provides her with the medicine necessary to have an abortion. So you have a charismatic preacher of the Second Great Awakening in the early days of the Second Great Awakening impregnating a woman, and somebody had to be punished. Now, he ends up going to jail for 2 years for sexual assault. Not a very steep punishment, considering he could have gotten life at the time for sexual assault. And then he spends the rest of his life saying he didn't do it. And he writes memoir after memoir like this one, in which he basically says he was falsely accused. He was really just imprisoned because he didn't believe in the blurring of church and state. We won't get into that discussion because the Supreme Court has clearly blurred that recently as well. But that's what Ammi Rogers has to say. And what's interesting is the New Jersey legislature takes up the case, and they pass, in response to this case, the first laws restricting abortion anywhere in the country, even though that law also only criminalizes it after the quickening. So it is post-quickening, and unfortunately, that law in New Jersey, it blames not the perpetrator, but the woman. And the woman can, and this is the history for where we are today. That was the first law in the United States to do it. It was the Second Great Awakening. Somebody had to be punished. Ammi Rogers, by the way, he blames the doctor for the potion for the abortion. He doesn't dispute that the woman is pregnant and has an abortion. He just says that the doctor gives her the medicine, not him. And that does also support the fact that, in general, doctors had no problem with dispensing medicine for inducing an abortion at that time. A fascinating history, and that's how we got to where we are in the United States. Now, listen, I'm a believer that old books can teach you a lot about our nation's history, and I encourage people to read books like this and not simply take for granted the word of a Supreme Court justice on what happened in American history. All right. If you're a watcher of this show, you know we like to end with a funny book. And we're going to end with a funny book today, even though it's been a serious topic. And last week, we did horse massage. So in keeping with horse massage and our desire to make fun of someone, we're going to make fun of lawyers, specifically horse lawyers, because I found this book also at the Whitlock's Book Barn called The Law and Your Horse. Now, if this were written in 1904, that would make some sense, but it was actually written in 1972. So shocking to believe that these were the questions on the minds of the horse lawyer in 1972. If a stray horse trespasses upon my property, do I have the right to keep him? If I run over a horse running loose on a public highway, am I liable for damages? If my horse dies while under the care of a veterinarian, can the doctor be sued for malpractice? Such are the stories in horse law, the law and your horse. Well, thanks for watching. We'll be back next week and every week on Friday for another edition of By Day. See you then.